considering council or mayor, right?
Council.
Hello, Rhonda. I haven't seen you for a long time.
I didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of body of work there. What I would say is there's, whether there's the committees that you sit on or just regular council meetings, whatever, there's a lot of reading. Some of the council packages, as an example, can be kind of thick, to say the least, to get through, and it's not exactly inspiring reading. Often it's pretty dry. But if you're not someone who's very good at sitting down and reading through large packages, it's tough going. But you need to do that because in preparation, if you're going to do your job at the council meeting, you need to be prepared and you need to be well versed and briefed. And if you had any outstanding questions, ideally you can deal with a lot of that in advance of the council meetings, because you don't want to take up more time in a council meeting than you absolutely need to. One of the problems that makes the job harder is when you have council meetings that go on forever, because people are asking questions on stuff that could have been dealt with beforehand with staff or whatever, where you could have had your questions answered or whatever, but then in a public forum and so on, they can be just much more long and drawn out. So there's the prep role, and then there's the actual being there. And it's the same with the committees. Depending on the committees you're on, some are not a huge amount of work. They're fairly straightforward. And others are a tremendous amount of work because they're quite complex issues. There are, a lot of technical, information that you need to digest and get up to speed on. And of course, the first 6 months is drinking from a fire hose. Because no matter what your background is coming into this, I can guarantee you that there'll be a ton of it you've never ever run into before. And so you kind of got to really dig in to find your way through all that at the beginning, and those committee meetings and so on are part of that. That being said, the time commitment that I found for me was I sat on 3 committees, 4 committees, depending on different times and at different periods. But I found that it was pretty solid 3 days a week. With all your reading and you have some flexibility in your hours, but some of the scheduling is, was pointed out, is you don't have flexibility. You've got to be there when you got to be there. But overall, the workload was probably around 2.5 to 3 days a week. If you're super efficient, maybe you can do even less than that. But I found, like I said, with reading the council packages, you get pretty good at reading the council packages after a while, and you can skim through them quite well and get a gist of what is, where the salient points are and what you need to think about. But it's pretty hard, I think, to do it if you're not prepared to commit pretty solid to that time each week. And you're not going to be probably as thorough as I think you probably should. The other thing I would really say is you need to show up. As Woody Allen used to say, the world's run by those that show up. And the truth is if you can't commit to the time and being whether it's on a committee or being in the council meetings and being there with a really good attendance record, you're doing a disservice to the office, because those votes, those dialogues, those conversations are there. The other thing that we found we had I think quite a remarkable council. It was very lucky, and we did a lot of discussion outside of council and outside of the formal meetings with one another at different times. There are restrictions that if you have a quorum, in other words, if you get together with the other councillors and you form quote unquote a quorum, you're technically not supposed to be speaking about any business affairs or anything to do without a staff member being in attendance. That is a rule, but I will say that we did a lot of that because we found those informal discussions were often really productive. It's a very different thing to be debating in the public domain or asking questions, or if you and I are having a difference of opinion on something and doing that in the public domain, or off trying to reach consensus together outside of the sort of having to debate that in public. And we were particularly allergic to the public side because when we came into council, the previous council was so toxic that all the incumbents were thrown out. There wasn't a single incumbent that kept their seat because they were so dysfunctional, and they were sniping at each other publicly. They were going, and attacking staff publicly and giving wonderful juicy quotes to the press and all the rest of it. And it became so dysfunctional that it really affected everything. And we really decided we weren't going to do that. And so we made a big effort to really have dialogue as a group, as individuals with one another, so that we already had kind of consensus, where we tried to achieve some level of consensus before we ever actually sat in the public domain. And I think it was very effective because what it was meant that we were constantly communicating. There was no, you're not telling, out of school secrets, you're not going behind someone's back, you're not, criticizing someone publicly, which is just toxic, right? And so I would, again, that comes back to showing up. So just the core work is one thing, but there's this informal stuff that is also very important, and be prepared for that. And that's a lot easier to do if you're getting along well, and you enjoy the people you're with, and so on. And I know for me that was one of the greatest things coming out of being council is I've got lifelong friends on council that I never met, people I didn't know that well before that have become lifelong friends, because it was such a wonderful, great experience to have to do all that together. And I would wish that on any and every council that could come out of that. And I think the current council's had some good luck with that as well. So
yeah, I would agree, Jason. And I think that's such a key word on council's consensus. And I think it's a really important point to think about. And you may have the strongest views in the world, but if you can't get the other 6 members of the council and mayor to agree with you, it's not going anywhere. So
yeah. And we came in, it was funny, when we came in, we were being elected partially because the social contract with the community had been broken. Spending was post-Olympics, spending was, there was significant concerns about the finances of the municipality. There was a real perception that council and so on had just run crazy with a whole bunch of things. And so when we came in, there was an expectation that we were going to, while the perception was that staff was out of control and the budgeting had gone crazy and the benefits for staff were out of control and everything else. And so there were a lot of people that ran. And then when we came in, the perception was that we were going to fire a third of the staff and, do all this crazy stuff, which was never what any of the people that at least that got elected were actually intent on doing. But there was a real interesting, and I'll tell the anecdote, the first meeting we ever had with staff after being elected, and I think staff, because we were all new, they were thinking, holy Christ, what are we going to be dealing with? These people are going to be a nightmare. And so the tension in the room was palatable. And then very quickly on after that, we established a very solid relationship with staff in that it's about professional respect. And we as counselors, we made a pact with one another where we said, look, the first thing we're going to do is check your ego at the door. There's no place for it in these meetings. And unfortunately, especially in local government politics, well, I guess all levels, there often are people that are there with a big ego involved, and they're so sure about their position, they're willing to shout from the highest rafter, and challenge everybody who doesn't agree and everything else. And we said, okay, first off, check your ego at the door. You're here to work as a team, and as much as possible, learn. No matter how much you think you know about your particular issues or your history or your experience, guaranteed there are other people around the table that have a different perspective and maybe even more experience than you do on these particular issues. So you need to listen, right? The old saying, one mouth, two ears, listen twice as much as you talk. The second thing was, if you don't have something really to contribute to the conversation, then shut up. Because so many times you have people that just want to talk, and they're not actually contributing any real value to what the dialogue and the discussion is. They just wanted to hear their own voice and sound like, oh, I got an opinion, I got to throw it in there. Well, actually, you don't. If it's moving the conversation forward, providing enlightenment or insight to whatever the topic is, by all means, absolutely you should. But that was another thing that we really tried to institute that discipline among ourselves, so that when we got to council meetings or in committee meetings or anything else, we tried to be productive and allow space for the people that had something really important to say that could move the conversation forward. They had space to say that, as opposed to being crowded with other people just trying to, get their opinion heard, so they could maybe get recognition in the paper or whatever it is. So those were some really key aspects of just the dynamics and the energy within the group. And so, and I think that respect, professional respect thing is really important. Whether it's the mayor's chair or whether it's your councilor's chair, or whether you're sitting on the board of the library or the board of the museum or whatever, it's not about you. It's about you and the position that you represent and the respect for the office that you now hold. And that's really important because, again, sometimes people like Donald Trump lose perspective on the office versus the individual. And the office is what you have to give respect and credibility to. And that's why you're there at the table. If you're sitting at the museum board or Parks and Trails, committee or whatever, you're the representative of, council, and therefore the public that's been elected you to that position. And you always need to keep that in mind. So that puts a bit of a good temper on your personal beliefs, because if you think about that often, that you're representing this much bigger, group and perspective behind you. It isn't just about you. That's not to say that you haven't been elected because you have a certain personal perspective that the electorate thinks is good, but it does mean that you have to temper that a little bit as well.